It's often thought that the most brutal and stereotypical Nazi was Reinhard Heydrich. Cold, cool, calculated, psychopathic, displaying absolutely no emotions apart from clinical, crude efficiency. It's also thought the most brutal and stereotypical Nazi was Hitler, raving and raging and living in a dream world. But the most brutal and stereotypical Nazi, ironically, was neither Heydrich, nor Hitler, nor Himmler, and in fact wasn't even German. He was a Russian, a mixed race, mixed culture, multilingual Russian, but so distinguished himself with his sadism, barbarity and bestiality that even Hitler found him repulsive. And what have you done in your short, sad life that even Hitler thinks you're a piece of work? You truly have to be a piece of work, and this piece of work's name was Bronislav Vladislavovich Kaminski. Bronislav Kaminski was a man as complicated as he was cruel, as impulsive as he was intelligent, and even his early life is complicated, because so much is known, yet so much is contradictory. According to what appears to be his grandson, posting online, Kaminski was born on June 16, 1899, in Dobryzin, Lipnov County, in the Kingdom of Poland. According to other records, he was born in Dobryzin, but in Polotsk County, in Belarus's Vitebsk Governorate, and was from a Russified Polish noble family that had lived in St. Petersburg at the end of the 19th century, then migrated to Belarus. And he was just as ethnically mixed as he was culturally. His father Franz was a hereditary Polish nobleman, while his mother Eva, Polish on her father's side and Baltic German on her mother's side, had been born in Latvia. This, at the time, wasn't hugely unusual. Pre-Holocaust Belarus had quite the mixture of ethnicities, including Russians, Jews and Poles, but in spite of this, Kaminski wasn't what you'd call tolerant. He considers himself a Russian, note the term Russified, and often displayed a passionate contempt for Poles, in spite of his mixed blood and origins. This was typical of people, quote, Russified back then, especially hereditary nobles, and others who looked down on Ukrainians, Poles and, quote, lesser races, but it seems rather extreme, given who his parents were. Their parents' son, however, didn't let it get in the way of his personal advancement. In 1917, he enrolled at the Petrograd Polytechnic Institute, but soon dropped out, in part because of the Bolshevik Revolution. Highly ambitious, Kaminski, wouldn't you know, the racist, rich nobleman's son, suddenly claimed he supported the Bolshevik vision of a classless, capitalismless society, and joined them. In 1918, he joined the Red Army as a volunteer, and fought against the pro-capitalist White Armies, containing many of his fellow nobles, from 1918 to 1921, presumably around St. Petersburg. After a few years of proving himself, he became a member of the Bolshevik Party in 1920, then was demobilised and returned to the Polytechnic Institute, where he earned his degree in chemical engineering, after which he was sent for an internship at the Respublika plant. He worked there for 6 years and did really well. He was made a pioneer of socialist competition and made many rationalisation proposals for firing. For his excellent performance, he was sent, as part of the so-called industrialisation recruitment campaign, to study at the Leningrad Institute, and his thesis was actually on a new method for firing chemical components to produce bluing, and it seemed like, for all intents and purposes, the intensely ambitious Kaminski wasn't feeling at all blue, but going up in the world. And just as quickly began shooting back down to it, when his career stifled on the brink of success. Kaminski was a heavy drinker, and had a penchant for consuming excessive quantities of vodka, which, needless to say, stifled his work abilities. He also had a penchant for, let's just say, personal enrichment. By the mid-1930s, due to his subpar performance, and his reputation for sticking his hand in the cookie jar, Kaminski hadn't reached the goodies he'd hoped for, and of course, began projecting. He began complaining about the Communist Party, its personnel, its policies, its procedures, especially collectivization. Many of his complaints were indeed true, but because he was so open about them, including around pro-Soviet elements, some of them, inevitably, reported him to the secret police. In 1935, he was expelled from the party for criticising collectivization, and arrested twice, but released. In the summer of 1937, however, he was arrested for a third time, and convicted of belonging to the so-called Chayanov Counter-Revolutionary Group, a completely fictitious organisation, known as the Labour Peasant Party, which the Soviet regime basically fabricated in order to arrest prominent agrarian economist Alexander Chayanov, and then used to imprison anyone who criticised collectivization. Some say Kaminski was also accused of being a Bukharinist, but either way, his vocal criticisms of communism didn't help him. His family were evicted from their apartment and ordered to be exiled to the north. Amazingly, Bronislav's sister Antonina twice travelled to Moscow, was twice received by the first secretary of the trade unions, and twice managed to get the eviction and exile cancelled, but it seems either the authorities were onto him, or Kaminski couldn't just shut up, because he was sent into exile. This was, of course, a suspiciously lenient punishment for someone who had been arrested 3 times and convicted once. People were shot for much less. Instead, he was comfortably exiled to the village of Suorka in Uprovsky district, then became a distiller in Shadrinsk, something which the alcoholic must have loved. In August 1939, Antonina and his children even visited him in Shadrinsk, something that was very, very lenient, because Kaminski was a spy. Not a Bukharinist spy, not a Labour Party spy, no, not a Polish or German spy. He was an NKVD agent, using the overly cool nickname Ultramarine to spy on and cultivate exiled Trotskyists. So the guy who was supposedly anti-communist, anti-collectivization and anti-tyranny, for a cushy life, and to save himself, was getting real distance shot. In late 1940, he was released and sent to a settlement in Lokot, Bryansk, where he worked as a chief distiller, and no doubt, just as with the till, helped himself to an example of the liquid refreshments. And once again, in the late autumn and early winter of 1940, he was able to see his family. I have to mention this due to the Kaminski sympathetic myths, that he was horribly repressed in the Gulag, a downtrodden prisoner of conscience, a true dissident. In reality, he did little dissenting from the system at all, especially when the Germans came. On June 22nd, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and by October 4th, the Germans had occupied Lokot. They expected more of a fight for the region, but not much fight was put up, in part because it was seething with anti-communist sentiment. Lokot was a place where convicted political prisoners, forbidden to return to their places of residence, were sent, and, isolated from their families and living in a downtrodden drunken backwater they hated, tended to be just the tiniest bit anti-communist. And Bronislav Kaminski, the most downtrodden and drunken of them all, in quotes, was one of the first to offer his services, along with his new friend, Konstantin Voskoboynik. Voskoboynik is another incredibly interesting, incredibly complex character. He was born in 1895 in Kiev, as the son of a railway worker. In 1915, he studied law at the Moscow State University, and in 1916 he had, just like Kaminski, volunteered for the front, but as a nationalist Tsarist soldier. In 1919, after possibly being in the White Army, he joined the Red Army, and in 1920 was demobilised due to an injury, but still managed to make secretary of a military commissariat. In the spring of 1921, however, he defected from the Red Army and took part in an agrarian peasant uprising, serving in the Vokulin Popov detachment. After the uprising was suppressed, however, the man who had switched sides at least twice realised he might be in some hot water and hid in plain sight under the name Ivan Yakovlevich Loshakov, and Mr. Loshakov, in quotes, made good. He graduated from the electromechanical faculty of the Plekhanov Institute of National Economy, worked as head of electrical measuring workshops at the Chamber of Weights and Measures, and then, in 1931, goofed majorly. He went to the OGPU and confessed who he was. Yes, he actually went to Stalin's secret police and said, "Oh, by the way, I'm not Ivan Yakovlevich Loshakov, I'm actually Konstantin Voskoboynik, a traitor who used to be part of the Tsarist forces, then part of your forces, then switched sides to fight them again, got a new identity, and fooled you all this time. So we cool, right?" Inevitably, they were not cool, and Voskoboynik was exiled to Novosibirsk for 3 years. To this day, nobody has any idea why Voskoboynik did this. He'd gotten away scot-free, he was free on the run, leading a good new life. Was he fed up of his new identity, didn't think he'd be caught inevitably, was he already caught? Either way, he was punished for his honesty through exile. After his release, he worked in construction in Kryvyi Rih, Orsk and other locations around Ukraine, and was highly intelligent, so managed to put his brain to good use. 1941 found him teaching physics at the Brasov Hydromelioration Technical School in Lokot, and then the Germans showed up. Once they showed up, Voskoboynik and Kaminski approached them, and what do you know? They were Nazis now, wanting the quote, complete destruction of the communist and collective farm system in Russia, the fighting of quote, Jewish Bolshevism, and the quote, free transfer of all arable land to the peasantry. Seems legit, but the Germans seemed to think so, and on October 16th, the German authorities allowed the creation of the Lokot Autonomy, a semi-autonomous republic headed by Voskoboynik, and on November 25th, Kaminski and Voskoboynik established the National Socialist Party of Russia. To this day, people have claimed the reason Voskoboynik and Kaminski established the party was because their years under the hateful communism had radicalized them and turned them into fascists. But to me, studying the documents, it's abundantly clear that the two, a former Red Army soldier and a former Red Army commissar, were opportunists who established the party and militia as a way to get power for themselves. Kaminski had flipped from noble to Red Army critic, to Gulag inmate, to NKVD spy, like some people put on clothes, and Voskoboynik went from fighting for nationalism to fighting for Bolshevism to fighting for an agrarian peasant uprising, so it seems this was just par for the course for these two opportunists. And nothing shows this more than their party. Although it did manage to hold some early meetings that attracted genuine dissidents, and although many men angry at communism did join their militia to fight the communist partisans, the party not only supported all Hitler's campaigns against so-called Jewish Bolshevism during the Holocaust, but also began to talk about the, quote, merciless extermination of the Jewish former commissars, and Voskobojnik personally sent around a proclamation that read, I propose that all partisans operating in the Brasovsky district and its immediate surroundings, as well as all persons involved with them, surrender all weapons they possess to the elders of nearby villages within 1 week, i.e. no later than January 1st, 1942, and report to the district headman's office in the village for registration. All who fail to appear will be considered enemies of the people and exterminated without mercy. All tales about the return of the Soviet regime to the occupied regions are absurd, unfounded rumors spread by malicious Soviet elements with the aim of disorganizing citizens and maintaining a state of disorder and uncertainty among the broad working population. The Stalin regime is inevitably dead. It is time for everyone to understand this and embark on the path to a peaceful working life. Did they have much of a choice? But Voskobojnik himself didn't have much of a choice to savour his choice. Even though he'd organised a militia of over 200 people, even though he now had his party, even though he now had his power, the new so-called mayor of Lokot wasn't mayor for long. Because of those very same partisans, who decided to embark on a peaceful working life of their own, by assassinating him. On the night of January 7th, 1942, the town of Lokot was dark, but in some places very, very brightly lit up. The people here were religious, glad to have thrown off the Soviet yoke, and celebrated Christmas with gusto, which included lighting up Voskobojnik's town hall headquarters with even greater gusto, as well as getting drunk. It was almost like they put up a beacon saying, hey, hey, notice us, and the partisans did. An attack by Saburov's partisan detachment slaughtered over 50 police officers, out of a militia of over 200, in the drunken chaos, as well as killing a probably drunk Voskobojnik himself. And wouldn't you know, one person who was suspiciously underdrunk was Bronislav Kaminski. The same person who slipped out of the headquarters just before the attack happened, the same person who hadn't drunk much that night, the same person who was one of the only high-ranking officers that was left, and the same person who somehow had Soviet partisans attack right in the middle of his supposedly highly defended town, staging a clearly pre-planned operation with suspiciously no hindrance. What a coincidence. Just like the bomb, placed precisely underneath his seat, that killed Akhmat Kadyrov, while leaving Ramzan alone, or the bomb that killed Akat Bragin, while leaving Renat Akhmetov in charge of his huge criminal empire. I'm just saying. That left... such a pity. Kaminski in charge of all Voskobojnik's money, all Voskobojnik's assets, all Voskobojnik's partisans and all Voskobojnik's party, and he began putting them to good use. For himself. Immediately, he was made head of the Lokot Republic, and began rapidly increasing his men, branding them Roskaya Svobodatylnaya Narodnaya Armia, or Russian National Liberation Army. Into this, quote, army, many of which didn't even have uniforms, were drawn genuine dissidents, genuine opportunists, people who were a mixture of both, Red Army powers who avoided to join starving to death, local mercenaries and criminals who just wanted to plunder and loot, and a mixture of these. Others who might have been the tiniest bit reluctant were press-ganged into joining, with several people accused of disloyalty being shot in front of the potential, quote, conscripts, after which they were given a choice, either join us or follow them. Unsurprisingly, other people were also Nazis now, and began joining the so-called People's Militia. And the militia did begin to expand, through mixing together dissidents, dissenters, drunks, degenerates and debauchees. Kaminski, with the Germans' help, began to form something of an army. 1,400 men were collected by early 1942, and in April, Kaminski received autonomy and self-governing powers, under the supervision of Major von Veltheim and Colonel Karl Rubsam, and used this authority to expand his brigade to 8,000 men. By the spring of 1943, Kaminski had 12,000 men and counting, and also began collecting armour. By early 1943, he had 1 heavy KV-2 tank, 2 medium T-34s, 3 BT-7s, 2 BT-5s, and 3 armoured cars. By September 1943, the brigade had 24 captured Soviet tanks and armoured vehicles, and, partly due to powers, knew how to use them, as well as having equipped most of its units with uniforms and a standard patch, as seen here. These men were used to fight the partisans, which at some points had over 30,000 men, and controlled a huge portion of German Area 532, between Orel and Kursk, and were regularly sabotaging and assassinating German units. The Kaminski Brigade was used, in cooperation with the Durlavanger Regiment and other units, in so-called Bandenbekämpfung, or bandit fighting, to root out the partisans. And this they did with absolute mercilessness. If Kaminski's men were brutal to each other, you can sure as hell bet they were brutal to civilians. Alongside the notorious Derlevanger unit, led by rapist, psychopath and sadist Oskar Derlevanger, it seemed Kaminski's men were competing with who could be the most sadistic and brutal. It took part in multiple anti-partisan sweeps through the villages and forests, including Operation Vogelsang, Operation Zagunebaron, Operation Freischutz and Operation Tannhauser. In all these operations, it was mandatory to kill anyone even suspected of supporting the partisans, let alone being one. And of course, burning whole villages, raping their women and bayoneting people was standard. Felix Dunayev, a veteran of the war, remembered, "Everyone who could, from the average policeman to Kaminski himself, robbed the population. During the existence of the Kaminski Brigade, at least 5,000 heads of cattle alone were exterminated, plus about 4,000 heads were taken to Germany, not counting pigs, sheep and poultry. The cattle and poultry are primarily taken from the families of partisans, and those associated with them. Usually, when it became known that a villager was in a partisan detachment or assisting them, their family was robbed, and everything was taken. Cattle, poultry, food, and even clothing. All the goods looted from the population were stored in a special warehouse, owned by Kaminski, who distributed them to his confidants. Just around Bryansk and Vitsebsk from 1941 to 1943 alone, Rona killed more than 10,000 people, burned 203 alive, completely burned down 24 villages, and 7,300 collective farms, the same collective farms they claimed were liberating, and destroyed 767 institutions, communist or not, creating a total loss of more than 900 million rubles, even more to civilians than to the Bolshevik government. Although several thousand of their victims were partisans, most were not, and some were even their own soldiers killed for dissenting, which increasingly became a thing. Kaminski was an incredibly complicated man. Writer T.N. Danilovich remembered he had a winning presence, businesslike, imposing, in a uniform of English cloth and cut, without any insignia. He carried himself with ease, with a sense of dignity, and his literary speech, untainted by Soviet overtones, left a favourable impression. Felix Decker, reporting to the Führer, remembered Kaminski as a, quote, good tactician, although not a soldier, with a, quote, impeccable family life. General Schmidt, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, claimed Kaminski had created a, quote, island within a vast partisan territory, which had not only tied up significant numbers of partisans, but also helped German troops immeasurably, and that, quote, thanks to the successful deployment of Russian troops, under Kaminski's leadership, it became possible to avoid recruiting new German units, and preserve German blood in the fight against the partisans. On the other hand, Kaminski's flaws soon showed themselves. A.A. Dollert remembered Kaminski handling the Germans with such self-confidence and arrogance that it became insolence, and one of his former soldiers remembered, he possessed a certain duality. On the one hand, he was a man of great personal courage and bravery, while on the other, he was hysterical. While undoubtedly gifted, a good organiser, and a talented military leader, he lacked a sense of proportion. While Voskoboynik, an intelligent man, had tried to combine carrot and stick methods by using some ideology to get people to his side, Kaminski almost exclusively used violence, and that violence lost all proportion when he was enraged, especially as 1943 unfolded and the Germans began to lose the war. The partisans, much more shrewd than he, used methods such as amnesties, food and support to turn as many of Kaminski's troops as possible, which resulted in whole units defecting, whole units disintegrating, and multiple attempts on Kaminski's life. Kaminski responded not with ideology or understanding, but with anger and aggression, and this often had the opposite effect. All kinds of people he suspected of opposing him were shot or murdered, which only made rebellions worse. When Major Tarasov, one of his main commanders, was promised amnesty for he and his whole unit if he joined the partisans, Kaminski heard of it and used those same hands, no gun in them, to throttle Tarasov to death in front of his whole unit, then wondered why the whole unit deserted anyway. Gallows erected in front of his HQ, with men swinging from them, didn't help. Neither did regular partisan sweeps, in part because the Red Army was aggressively sweeping forward. After the Germans were defeated in the August 1943 Battle of Kursk, the front began pushing west, toward Lokot territories, and something told Kaminski and the Germans that maybe they couldn't hold this territory with overtaxed German troops, undermotivated Hungarian conscripts, and a bunch of drunks in uniform. And on August 23rd, 30,000 Russians and collaborationists, including 22,000 civilians, and only 6,000 remaining Kaminski Brigade members, retreated into Belarus, into the Lapel region, leaving behind any who wished to stay and defend. To their meagre credit, some of the soldiers were good troops, who at least tried to fight. As early as March, Kaminski's men fought the regular Red Army, in the Soviet Sevsk operation, when the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps of General Kryukov broke through to the German rear. Kaminski's men, over the course of 2 days, fought heavy battles with his forces, and even though they were defeated, some of them stood their ground. After August 23rd, some Rona men stayed behind, including the 4th Rifle Regiment, which held Sevsk for over 8 hours, until being outflanked by a tank strike. There was also fierce fighting in the town of Lokot itself, in which Kaminski's men fought hard. All this, however, couldn't delay the inevitable, and the homeland was lost. On August 23rd, Kaminski's men, and his huge column of refugee civilians, ended up, by train, in the Lapel region of Belarus's Vitebsk. Kaminski, not seeming to realise the problem was with him, chose, instead of becoming a humble, repentant refugee, to once more become a seething sociopathic lunatic, and tried to set up the so-called Lapel Republic in the area, while once more committing his men to anti-partisan operations, often in very italicised quotes. Operations such as Reagan Shower, Fruchtlingsfest and Komoran, in which over 15,000, quote, partisans were killed in the final 2 operations alone, were joint German Kaminski ops that often did nothing to partisans while harming civilians, and mobilised the partisans so well that Kaminski and his men were often surrounded in their town headquarters, as partisan microphones asked them to surrender, and receive amnesty. Kaminski and his men, however, did not surrender, and had distinguished themselves for their brutality. The Germans enjoyed seeing lots of undesirable Slavs slaughtering each other, often one way round, and nobody enjoyed this more than the Reichsfuhrer SS. Heinrich Himmler was very impressed by Kaminski, had his brigade renamed the Volksheer Brigade Kaminski, or People's Brigade Kaminski, one of the only divisions ever to have been given such a name, and met him on July 30th, 1944. During the meeting, Kaminski was personally promoted to the rank of Waffenbrigadeführer and Major General of the Waffen-SS, the only person to ever receive such a rank, as well as receiving the Iron Cross First Class. It seemed, ironically, that all Kaminski's dreams were coming true. He had power, prestige, respect, a clear career, coming just at a time when his homeland was clearly lost, coming just at a time when Germany was about to lose the war, and just at a time when he and his 30,000 plus loyalists had nowhere to go. One has to wonder if Kaminski's alcohol problems maybe got worse as he sat in his seat afterward, wondering when he'd next be sitting in a gulag. And Kaminski's alcohol problems definitely got worse after August 4th. On August 1st, an order had been given to form the 29th Waffen Grenadier Division Rona of the SS, with Kaminski at its head. 3,000 personnel of the brigade were stationed in the SS training camp in Neuhammer, preparing to be formed up, and once more it seemed everything was going well for Kaminski, but then the Warsaw Uprising began that same day, and Kaminski was ordered to send men to help put it down. They arrived on August 4th, and went into battle that very next day. A huge uprising by Polish nationalist partisans had risen up in Warsaw, as the Soviets approached, and the Germans had begun to savagely counterattack, especially in the suburbs of Wola and Ochota, and they wanted Kaminski to be a part of this. Kaminski, realising that maybe motivation was low among his men, and that some of those there, like him, were still there because they had no place to go, formed a unit of 1,700 unmarried men, chosen from volunteers, maybe realising having less family would make them more likely to risk. In terms of equipment, as well as standard KAR 98K rifles, the Kaminskis were equipped with 4 T-34 tanks, an Su-76 gun, and 2 122mm howitzers. Ivan Frolov was appointed commander of the regiment and took the unmarried men. Meanwhile, the married men were ordered to escort the civilians to Carpathia and Ruthenia. As you would expect, the conduct of the brigade in the city was deplorable. On August 5th, during the fighting, a so-called transition camp for displaced people was created, in the area of the Ochota vegetable market, where tens of thousands of civilians were gathered, and gradually expelled to Proshkov. On the way, SS officers and blind drunk Rona members murdered and raped the civilians, killing thousands, with the bodies of those who died simply being piled against a wall. On August 5th and 6th, the Rona units murdered over 150 people at the Radium Institute on Wawelska district, and then moved on to the Kolonia Stashetsa housing estate, raping, robbing and murdering civilians, and burning the bodies on the grounds of the Hugo Kontowai High School. Eventually, over 10,000 people were killed in the Ochota massacre. The unit also saw action in Wola, where things got even worse. The Germans, Azeris, Ukrainians and other auxiliaries shot people indiscriminately, raped and murdered, used civilians as human shields, and murdered around 10,000 people, just around Gochevska Street and Mochidwo Street alone. Over 6,000 people were murdered in the Ursus factory, 4,000 were murdered in the Franashek factory, and 1,000 were murdered at the tram depot at Mowenowska Street, and on Volska Street, and in the Slovinska Park. In some places, the burned bodies were piled 25 metres high. The total number of those killed in Wola is estimated around 50,000 people, and when you add that to Ochota, that's 60,000 killed, of the 200,000 civilians killed in Warsaw. And the Kaminskis got their loot and then some. V.S. Kristoforov, head of the FSB archival department, estimates that each Rona soldier had 15 or 20 gold watches each upon returning, which not many of them did, which is amazing given their numerical and firepower advantage. The 1,700 Kaminski men were first given the task of clearing the Ochota district, defended by only 300 poorly armed Poles, many of whom were low on ammunition. The attack was planned for the morning of August 5th, but when the time came, Kaminski's men could not be found, because they were looting abandoned houses in the rear. They were reformed, and the attack finally got underway before noon. And it went poorly, abysmally, disastrously. The Kaminski men were only used to roughing up civilians in the rear, often with German and Hungarian support. Many of their hardened combat veterans were dead or deserted, and they were left with the equivalent of 30s Gopniks, with the morale of a dead dog, with the result being, predictably, that the brigade advanced only 275 metres before nightfall. For many of these stupid hicks, it was the first time they'd even seen a city, and they fought appallingly, atrociously, terribly, while suffering high casualties. It then moved on to the Vola sector, and did no better in combat there. In one instance, a unit stopped its advance to loot a captured building, right on the front line, and was subsequently cut off and destroyed by Polish soldiers. General Erich von den Bach remembered that the unit, quote, had no military combat value whatsoever, with both officers and soldiers having not even a hint of tactical understanding. I saw Kaminski's men removing entire cartloads of stolen jewellery, gold watches, and precious stones. The capture of a liquor supply was more important for the brigade than the seizure of a position commanding the same street. Each assault was instantly stopped, because after taking the objective over, units dispersed into loose, plundering hordes. Furthermore, Kaminski, drunk on alcohol and on power, refused to take orders from von den Bach, claiming he was answering only to Himmler. He also freely joined in the plundering, claiming it was all for his Russian Liberation Fund, wink wink, and that since the Rona men had lost all their homes and property, they deserved to just loot whoever the hell they got their hands on. Kaminski, at least no physical coward, led an assault on a factory in person, in which he was wounded, and in which he lost over 70 men, taking it from some badly armed, exhausted Poles, who still managed to hold him back, while being bombarded constantly by his overwhelming artillery and air cover. And the people who were also exhausted of Kaminski were the Germans. Not only had they actually hindered the attempts to suppress the uprising, not only had resistance actually stiffened, but they'd been stiffed by a Kaminski promising that his newly christened 29th SS Division would do its job well, and instead lost around 500 of its 1,700 men in seizing a few metres of ground. In addition, they challenged German officers who tried to stop them with guns, and actually raped 2 German girls in the process. Major General Gunther Rohr, commander of Warsaw's southern sector, demanded the brigade be removed from his command, because of how utterly shitty they were. Bach agreed, and, very crucially, both men had the ear of Heinz Guderian, close to Hitler. As Guderian remembered, von den Bach informed me of the excesses of his subordinates, which he was unable to stop. His reports made my hair stand on end, so I was forced to report everything to Hitler that same evening, and demand the removal of both brigades, Kaminski and Derlewanger, from the Eastern Front. This demand was granted, and on August 19th, the brigade was withdrawn from Warsaw and sent to the Campinos Forest to attack and guard against partisans, where it performed atrociously. On September 2nd, in Truskau, a surprising attack on the Kaminski forces went so badly for them that it was described as a slaughter by the Poles, and when the Kaminski soldiers did open fire, they shot their own men. Others burned to death in barns, were so drunk that they couldn't even fight properly. The Poles lost a total of 10 dead, and the Rona, the small number of 250 men, a dozen guns, 30 ammunition wagons, and all their Warsaw loot. In Marianov the next night, it went just as disastrously. The Rona soldiers, all asleep, panicked and ran from the buildings, right into Polish shells. Coming to their, quote, aid, German and Russian outposts in nearby towns decided to fire their machine guns, and gunned down all the Rona soldiers trying to escape. 100 Rona soldiers and Germans were killed, 20 wounded, 24 taken prisoner, for the grand total of 1 guy dead. Yep, 1 guy dead. I can't with these guys. Every single thing about them was utterly shitty. And so was Kaminski's end. In fact, he wouldn't even live to see the shitty end of his shitty troops in their shitty defences in their shitty battles, because in his own shitty final battle, he didn't come out on top. Some think it's the rape of the 2 German girls. Some think it's because he was utterly fucking useless. Some think it's because the Germans were appalled by the atrocities, and others think it's because Kaminski and friends were stealing the property of the Reich, in very huge air quotes. Under SS law, all looted property was supposed to be the property of the Reich, to be given to Himmler for distribution, but Kaminski and his men had tried to keep it for themselves. Another reason, and one I find very, very interesting, is linked to perceptions of Kaminski's unreliability, and not just militarily, but politically. According to a report I've dug up, in 1944, a prisoner at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a former commander of a Soviet sabotage unit that fought near Orel, where Kaminski was stationed, managed to organise a disinformation, quote, leak that compromised Kaminski. Possibly using information on Kaminski's real former NKVD links, he, quote, confidentially informed a cellmate that Rona Commander Kaminski was actually a long-term NKVD agent, adding in the true, quote, speculation that he'd been infiltrated among the Germans to cause chaos in their ranks. And given that this was after the July 1944 bomb plot, and given that paranoia was at an all-time high, maybe the Germans looked at Kaminski and thought, all this incompetence, and he is Russian, and he is mixed race, and he has switched sides before. I personally think it was much more down to his incompetence, but either way, it's a fascinating story, and it's no theory what happened to Kaminski next. He and his leading men were called to a, quote, leadership conference in Lodz, but never got there. Instead, Kaminski, Chief of Staff Shavikin, Chief Physician Zabora, his translator and his driver were court-martialed and shot for stealing the property of the Reich, in quotes, which translated into the charges into encouraging requisitions and robberies. Kaminski did not go quietly into the shitty, self-righteous, scathing night. According to Alexander Dulin's The Kaminski Brigade, a case study of Soviet disaffection, Kaminski was enraged, one of the German officers recalled. Firstly, before going into action, his men had been promised a free hand. Secondly, he failed to understand the German point of view. He and his men had, in years of fighting for the Germans, lost all they had. And now they would not even be allowed to compensate themselves, at the expense of the treacherous and rebellious Poles. These, quote, serious altercations continued, with the part Polish, Polophobic Kaminski ranting and raging about Poles and Germans and whoever else he could think of, but it did no good. He and his protesting men, after being convicted, were led to a wall and, politely, shot to fucking pieces. There just remained one problem: his men. Some of Kaminski's men were very, very loyal to him. Just as with Derlevanger's, they kind of worshipped him as a hero, and when they were told, hey guys, what's good? Everything's going great. Oh, and by the way, Bronislav died in a Polish partisan ambush. Sorry about that. They got a little bit fighty, so the Germans realised, oh, these people are a bunch of fucking idiots. We know how to solve this. And in front of the drunks, they showed them Kaminski's shot-up car, smeared with goose blood, and basically said, so yeah, randomly, they were all ambushed by the Poles, who made sure to very carefully and respectfully carry their bodies away. So sorry about that. The Kaminski dudes and dudettes, either because they were just that fucking dumb, just that fucking fatigued, realised they had nowhere else to go, or, oh yeah, the Germans would fucking kill them all if they protested too much, just accepted it, I guess. And that was the end of the shitty Kaminski formation. Kinda, because the shittiness didn't exactly end there. A lot of the survivors died in the Campinos forest. Others died in combat. Others were put to work in Pomerania. Others helped to crush the Slovak uprising, with appalling brutality, passing the shittiness on, and others were passed on to the Russian Liberation Army, which were not happy to see them and thought them shittier than shit. Already disillusioned by how Hitler had only allowed them to form in 1944, when the war was already lost, and how he was only giving them fellow powers and forced labourers, General Bunyachenko, already disillusioned enough with the Germans, was enraged when the Rona transports pulled up, and off got men loaded with loot, and women wearing looted Polish furs, jewels and other riches. So this is what you're giving me. Bandits, robbers and thieves, he raged. You give to me what you can no longer use. The betrayal made all the worse by the fact that during his lifetime, Kaminski had agitated against Vlasov and the ROA, telling the Germans they were potential turncoats, and being one of many factors that stopped the Germans backing them until it was too late. And Bunyachenko was so enraged by this latest betrayal that it contributed to his decision to turn his guns on the Germans in the Prague uprising. Vlasov, however, while considering the Kaminski's mercenaries, after careful examination, allowed 1 in every 10 Kaminski men into his formation. So ironically, Bunyachenko's Russians came to the aid of the Czechs in Prague, and prevented the Germans from doing to the Czechs what they did to the Poles, and several Kaminski soldiers fought alongside them in doing just that, and probably died in the process. So yeah, history comes in a full circle, and no good, or very, very bad, deed goes unpunished. And many of the Kaminski men definitely got punishment, because the war was over, and now the Allies were turning over any captured Russian pro-German soldiers over to the Soviets, and others who were captured by the Soviets were shot or gulagged on sight. And others, ironically, like the defenders of Prague, were shot by Czech communist partisans in their hospital beds, and so ended the fate of thousands of Kaminski Brigade members, showing that no good deed goes unpunished, or no very, very, very bad deeds. But for a while, the Lokotch region was once more full of bad deeds too, because some of Kaminski's men decided to set up a, quote, resistance movement. In quotes, yes, because it turned to banditry and looting again. After looting, killing and terrorising people, it was finally destroyed by the KGB around 1951, after losing most of its support. And what have you done to people that you make the KGB look moderate? And so ends the life of Bronislav Vladislavovich Kaminski, the weird, wonderful life of a man who could have been anything, and instead became a rancorous crap stain who nobody liked.